Totally. I want to really thank the organizers for putting this together. I think this is an incredible group of people. It's not that often that you get people from all these different fields who really work on very related things talking to each other, and I think that's really important, and I really appreciate that. I also want to say I'm really appreciative of the fact that Ariel and Layla talked yesterday, because they introduced a lot of the ideas that I'm going to talk about today, so I can breeze through some things. So good to see you all. Happy to be here talking to you. I'm Alex Huth. I'm at UT Austin. I'm going to tell you about some of our work on mapping language representations in the brain. Yes, please. There we go. So I like to start with talking about what the basic questions are that we're trying to ask, because I feel like this is a point of kind of impedance mismatch between fields. It's not always obvious what are the important questions to people. So in my world, in sort of my neuroscience studies, what I want to know is about this process of language understanding. So I'm standing here right now, I'm producing language, I'm taking an idea from inside my head. It's being transmitted through sound waves in the air, or electrical impulses across the internet. This is going into your brain. Your brains are processing this information, likely through many different layers of processing. You're extracting sort of acoustic information, phonetic information, what the words I'm saying mean, and then you're trying to reconstruct, maybe at the end, the idea that I was trying to transmit to you, right? So the things that I'm really interested in here are what's going on in the brain? What are the different parts of the brain doing when we're processing language? What are the different parts of the brain representing in terms of language information? And then once you get to this point of having an idea that came out of my brain, what's the format of that? Like, what does an idea look like? What is a thought? I don't think we're going to be able to answer that question in any kind of reasonable way, but that's a kind of guiding light that we're looking toward here. So how do we get at this? Oftentimes, this is something that is maybe different to the audience, but I love that everybody here has been talking about the same kind of experiment, which is natural language experiments. So we put people in an MRI scanner, and then we just have them listen to podcasts. That's basically it. It's a really fun experiment to be a subject in. I'm one of the subjects that we have a ton of data on here. You just lay there and you listen to stories. It's natural. It's ethological. It's something that we do anyway for fun. All right, so we have a few subjects lay in the MRI scanner and listen to up to 20 plus hours of podcast stories, mainly from the Moth Radio Hour, if any of you are familiar, but also other sort of sources. And while people are listening to these stories, we're just continuously measuring their brain activity. Right? So every 2 seconds, we get a new image of the brain. So it's divided up into these 2.6 millimeter isotropic voxels, where we see this blood flow signal of how much sort of a proxy for how much neural activity there is in each piece of brain tissue. This is showing vaguely what this looks like across one person's brain. All right, so this experiment doesn't have hypotheses embedded in it. We have to model this data. We have to try to figure out what's going on. And the way that we do that is using this encoding model framework, which again, I'm very thankful for Layla and Ariel for introducing yesterday. It looks a lot like this. So we have our human brain responses here. We know exactly what the words were in the stories. We've gone through and annotated all the words. We know exactly when they occurred in these stories. So then we can extract features from these words. There are some vectors of numbers that represent information we think the brain might be encoding. This is kind of where the hypothesis comes in here, is how we extract these features. And then we use these features to build encoding models, right? So we're representing the response of some little chunk of brain tissue over time as, in most cases, just a linear combination of these features, right? So we know the X's here, and then we just estimate these betas using all this data that we have, this large data set. And then, of course, we can measure how well this model works by predicting responses on new stories that we didn't use to estimate the models. We can measure these correlations between predicted and actual brain responses and say, like, this is a good model of the brain or a bad model of the brain. We can model these brain areas well and these brain areas poorly, et cetera. But the real question is, what features are we going to use here? Like, what kinds of things, what kinds of numerical representations of these stories is actually useful? So there's one big unsurprisingly, given that I'm talking here about it, source of these features that has really taken over this field, which is using representations from neural network language models. So I remember the old days when we did this with simple hand-constructed features or word embeddings, which work like pretty well, all told, but they've really been blown out of the water by these neural network language model features. So this has become a really popular thing now. There's a kind of a field growing up around this that, as Layla talked about yesterday, this was sort of very early work on this, and Ariel has also done very foundational work on this. So we have this big area now of trying to understand the brain using these neural network models. So what kinds of information do we actually get out of this? How do we learn things from this? This is hard. This is a hard question to answer, it turns out. And I've been talking to you all over the past couple of days and heard you express also, like, what does this tell us? Like, where's the science? Like, what do we learn from this? So, the issue here is that these neural network language models, they are, albeit the great advances people have talked about in interpretation, they're still kind of black boxes. We don't really know what they're doing or how they're doing it. So how do they help us understand these language representations, and can they show us how these representations are organized in the brain? I'm going to show you a little bit of work right now by my now former student Shaylee Jane, who's now a postdoc at UCSF, but has done some fabulous work on this and sort of started this whole project in my lab. I'm just briefly going to tell you a little bit about like how we can use these models to measure things about different brain areas. So one of the things that Shaylee has done is work on these model interpretation techniques. So we have a model that we fit for one little chunk of brain, one little voxel in the brain. And what we can do is we can take a big library of, say, chunks of text. In this case, the model was predicting the brain responses based on like 10-word sequences. We can push all these word sequences through our encoding model, measure the predicted response. So we can say, like, how much does this model think the brain, this piece of brain tissue should respond to all these phrases. We can sort them according to their predicted response. So here's 140,000 different phrases. This is just one particular voxel. This number is meaningless. But this is sorted according to the predicted brain response. And then we can ask, what are the phrases that are in this top tail right here? What are the things that really drive the response in this one voxel? So I'm going to show you one example, which is something that I think is really kind of cute as something that I wouldn't have expected naively. Like, we'd have some piece of the brain that really likes. Here's one little chunk of brain tissue in the sort of medial prefrontal cortex that really responds to examples of politeness. So when you hear a phrase like motioned for me to sit next to him and thanked me, started to ask the lady a question, she said, excuse me, and she comes out and she says, look, I'm really sorry. You should probably go in and check there. So I say, thanks. These are all the kinds of phrases that this model says are driving this voxel. So we can get this kind of like fine-grained information about what an individual voxel seems to be doing, seems to be selective for. This is just showing, for comparison, if we use this word embedding approach, what kinds of interpretations we get. We can also look at this across many brain areas. So here's there we were looking in a lot of detail at one particular voxel in the brain, but we can also look at a sort of coarse-grained level across the entire brain. Here, this is a flattened out representation of one subject's cortex. This is left and right hemispheres. And the voxels that sort of respond significantly to these language stimuli, I've colored them here according to broadly what kinds of information they seem to respond to. So for example, the green voxels respond very strongly to phrases describing actions, whereas the red voxels here respond much more strongly to phrases describing like emotions. This is, again, a very coarse sort of version of this, but what you can see is that we can use these methods to now map out in even more detail than before these representations across the brain surface. So what do we do with this? Where do we go? How do we like use this to do something? I'm going to tell you about one thing that we can do that has ended up being like quite surprising, that it's possible using fMRI data. I don't know, maybe to the computer scientists, they're like, I don't know, what should you get from fMRI data? For cognitive neuroscientists, I think this is kind of like a, oh my God, like how is that possible thing? But what we're going to do is we're going to use the information, the sort of detailed information about what these little brain areas are selected for, to try to decode language from these brain signals. Right. So what I was talking about a moment ago was this encoding direction where we have the natural stimuli that are played for the subject. We get some fMRI data, and then we fit this model that predicts the MRI data from the stimuli. I'm going to show that we can also go the other direction, right? We can take the fMRI data, we don't know what the words were, and we can try to decode or pull out what the stimuli were that elicited those brain responses. And this is work now by my grad student, Jerry Tang, who's just finishing up shortly and has done fabulous work on this. So how do we go about this? I'm going to phrase this in sort of a Bayesian way for reasons that will make sense shortly. Let's say that decoding is we're trying to find the most likely stimulus given the responses, right? So we have some stimuli S, responses R. We're trying to model this distribution P of S given R, right? Trying to find the S that maximizes probability of stimulus given a response. But it turns out that directly building a model of P of S given R is very hard in this setting. This has to do with the sort of temporal properties of fMRI, that we're not measuring sort of instantaneous neural activity. We're measuring this incredibly slow, sloppy version of neural activity that you get from the blood flow signal in fMRI. Every image that we record is kind of like a mushy average of the last 10 or 15 seconds of words the person heard. And so disentangling this, having this sort of multiple dependence problem makes this inverse problem really hard. So fortunately, I've had very clever colleagues in the past. My friend Shinji Nishimoto developed this method a few years ago for trying to decode video stimuli from fMRI recordings. And we call this Bayesian decoding. So the idea is P of S given R, modeling this directly is very difficult, but we all know Bayes' rule. We can take P of S given R and we can represent it as a product of P of R given S, probability of response given stimulus, times P of S, just the probability of the stimulus. And it turns out that these things are much easier than the P of S given R, right? P of R given S, this is literally just the encoding model, right? This is the predictive model that takes the stimuli the person heard and predicts the brain responses from them. There's a little tweak on that, which is that we have to add like a noise model to that. That ends up being like deeply critical for how this works to actually convert these predictions into a probability. But if you want to know more about that, ask me. And then P of S, we all know this. This is just a language model, right? That's the kind of thing that we're all talking about here. So we can combine these things to try to model this P of S given R and sample from it and maximize it. Practically, how this works, I'll give you the sort of shrinklet version here. We just guess. We make guesses for what words the person might have heard. We sample from P of S. And then we can evaluate how good a guess is based on our encoding model, right? So we make a bunch of different guesses. Then we use our P of R given S model to evaluate each guess that we made, say like, was this a good guess or a bad guess? For the good guesses, we kind of keep them in our set. And for the bad guesses, we just discard them. Practically, we're doing this in a beam search framework. So we maintain a set of current guesses that we think are pretty good. For each of them, we propose some extensions, and then we narrow down the possible set again based on the likelihoods under our P of R given S model. Okay, let me show you how this works. So here's some examples from our actual stimuli. So on the top here is a little chunk of a story that a person actually heard, and on the bottom is the decoded version. So the actual stimulus here was, I didn't know whether to scream, cry, or run away. Instead, I said, leave me alone, I don't need your help. And the decoded version of this is, started to scream and cry, and then she just said, I told you to leave me alone, you can't hurt me. So obviously this is messing some things up, right? There's missing information, run away isn't there, I don't need your help isn't there. It confabulated this thing, you can't hurt me, which is kind of in the right realm of things, but wasn't one of the actual statements in the original. One notable thing that we find is that our decoding model, it really sucks at pronouns. I call this like the kind of boomer uncle model in a way. It's really worse at like first person versus third person. It doesn't know I versus she. It messes, or I versus he, whatever. It just messes this up continuously, and that's maybe a kind of interesting problem, or maybe it's just something that's not represented at the scale of fMRI that we can measure. But there's a shocking degree to which this gets things actually correct, right? So scream and cry, leave me alone. These are kind of stock phrases, but it's really pulling these things out of this data accurately in a way that I think would have been deeply shocking to cognitive neuroscientists 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever. Let me show you another example. Here, the actual stimulus was, I don't have my driver's license yet. I just jumped out right when I needed to. And she says, well, why don't you come back to my house, is how that finishes. And the decoded version is, she has not even started to learn to drive yet. I had to push her out of the car. I said, we will take her home. So this has, again, these approximate kind of gist preserving matches. I don't have my driver's license yet. She has not even started to learn to drive yet. I jumped out, pushed her out of the car. It's different and very different in terms of like the verb, the action that's happening here, but the thing of like a person leaving a vehicle in a sort of emergency way is still preserved. Of course, we get some words, exact words correct. One little funny thing here, it's hard to say for any one example, like why is this happening? Is it just inferring it from the context? But in this case, push her out of the car, jumped out. This doesn't contain of the car here, but this is referring to an event that happened earlier in the story where the narrator did jump out of a car. So I don't know, maybe it's just guessing that this was a car based on this context, or maybe it's actually the subject's understanding of the story. They knew what happened, and it's actually decoding that. But one thing I want to highlight here is I'm giving you these sort of qualitative versions of this, right? I'm showing you these examples and saying like this kinds of matches. Evaluating this quantitatively has been kind of a challenge. So for example, I don't have my driver's license yet, and she has not even started to learn to drive yet. Despite the agent change, these mean very similar things, right? But there's very little word-wise overlap. If we compute word error rate here, it's massive. Word error rate is almost 100, even though this is kind of a paraphrase of what's happening. So we've explored a bunch of different metrics. We've been sort of treating this as a machine translation problem in a way. So we measure word error rate, we measure blue and meteor. These are all kinds of like surface form metrics. Here, to put them all on the same scale, we just generated a bunch of text from our language model and then measured sort of null distribution of what each metric should be. So this is showing standard deviations away from the null distribution for each of these metrics. So even though the word error rate is 90%, that's still like 8 to 12 standard deviations above the null. When we look at another metric, so BERT score is a more meaning-oriented metric that's supposed to be able to capture whether phrases are kind of paraphrases of each other. When we look at that kind of thing, we see an even more sort of significant difference, 15 to 20 standard deviations away from the null distribution. I think if we were physicists, we would be pretty happy with this. I don't know. Okay, so quantitatively, this works pretty well. But everything I've shown you here is just for speech perception, right? This is somebody laying in the scanner, listening to stories to train our model. They lay in the scanner, listen to more stories, and then we decode data from that. Can we generalize beyond this setting? So one thing we tried is, can we have a person imagine a story instead of listening to a story? So can we decode somebody's thoughts instead of like the words they're hearing? This seems like a much less trivial thing in a lot of ways. And these things might not overlap, right? It might be that what we're decoding in all these cases is maybe more related to the lower level perceptual stuff that's happening. And if that's true, then this shouldn't work at all, right? We shouldn't be able to get anything out if the person is just like thinking a story in their heads. So we tried this. We had our subjects, how do you know what a person is thinking? We had our subjects memorize short stories, practice telling them over and over again so that they're pretty consistent in their timing. We recorded them telling these stories, and then we put them in scanner immediately afterward, scanned them, had them do the exact same protocol. So like tell story A, tell story B, but just don't move your mouth, right? Just like in complete silence. So now we had kind of ground truth for like what words we think they should be saying at each moment. And then what we actually decoded. So let me show you some examples here. The performance is generally worse than for the perception case, but it still clearly is getting something. So in the first example here, this chunk of the imagined story was, look for a message from my wife saying that she had changed her mind and that she was coming back. And the decoded version is, to see her for some reason, I thought maybe she would come to me and say she misses me. here the Imagine story was coming down a hill at me on a skateboard, and he was going really fast, and he stopped just in time. And the decoded version is, he couldn't get to me fast enough. He drove straight up into my lane and tried to ram me. Again, the like intentions are wrong, but the action is right. And the last example here, the Imagine story was, we went on a dirt road through a field of wheat and over a stream and by some log buildings. And the decoded version is, he had to walk across a bridge to the other side and a very large building in the distance. So clearly this is still working quite well. Let me show you one more generalization that's even stepping further away. This was all on language, right? We had people listen to language, imagine language. What if we just do a different modality? What if we have somebody watch a video? We did this. We just plugged into our model. Our model has never seen somebody seeing before. It's only seen how the brain responds to language. Let's show them a video. It's silent. They're just watching quietly. Let's plug that into our decoder and see what happens. So here I'm going to show a video, and along the bottom, you're going to see a readout of what the decoder says. I'll read along with it here. So the decoder starts, "Be so sad." And she said, "I know you did it for me and for you." She says, "Oh, I'm so sorry about that. You guys are so young. You must be so sad." She said, "I know you did it for me and for you." She then took my hand and held it to her lips. She kissed it. I smiled, and she pulled me in for a hug. I got her back for about hours. I had to stop the bleeding and gave her my shirt to put over it. So despite the fact the model has never seen vision before, it has no idea what the brain looks like when it's seeing things, we're clearly able to pull out this high-level semantic information. Even though, again, we're working in different modalities here. Okay, I'm going to skip this thing. Subjects have quite a lot of control over this. That's fine. So just to close this up, what I think this shows is that this kind of technique, we're using a language model both to generate the features and to sort of predict words in these stories. This works surprisingly well on language perception and on imagined speech and on non-language stimuli. And I think this goes some way towards this big question I started with at the beginning, like, what's the format of a thought? At least from this, we see that there's significant overlap between these semantic representations, the thoughts, the types of thoughts, the format of thoughts that's elicited by vision and language. Okay, so one final thing here. We're seeing with more recent kind of methods here, this is getting better as we put better language models into this. I didn't tell you which language model I was using here. This is all GPT-1. It turns out when you use more modern, better language models, this gets better, unsurprisingly. And we think it'll get better with closed loop decoders as well. When we show the person their output, they can refine their own sort of way of interacting with the machine. We're really interested in the possibility that this could help people with aphasia. So could we actually turn this into a brain-computer interface, not using fMRI, but probably using other neuroimaging techniques? I think this is a really exciting way forward. So yeah, let me just thank you all for listening and thank all the people who are involved in this, especially Shaylee and Jerry.